Establishing central pawn influence immediately opens lines for piece development and territorial control. Unlocking central space with this knight aims to build a flexible pawn structure, often leading to dynamic play. Challenging black's knight immediately, white aims to seize the center and gain an imposing pawn presence. Embracing the fianchetto, black prepares to launch a kingside assault, potentially disrupting white's central aspirations. Developing the knight to c3 now contests the center, preparing for rapid pawn advances and potentially a kingside attack. Challenging the center immediately, black opens lines and aims for active piece play, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure and creating dynamic imbalances. Developing the bishop here proactively challenges the central pawn structure and prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside. Developing the bishop to this diagonal prepares for a kingside castling and exerts pressure on the center. Fortifying the center with e3 is a solid, if somewhat passive, choice, prioritizing pawn structure over immediate dynamic engagement. Securing the king under the protective pawn shield. This prepares development and potentially signals a desire for queenside expansion or central pressure. Opening the center with this capture invites piece activity, potentially leading to sharper play rather than the quiet maneuvering often seen in this variation. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight opens up the c-file for white's rook and challenges the central pawn structure, forcing black to consider how to develop their pieces harmoniously, particularly the queenside. This recapture is a natural response, but the subsequent positional implications on the queenside require careful attention. Swapping the knight for the bishop here, white initiates a strategic repositioning, aiming to disrupt black's kingside fianchetto and gain better control over the central dark squares. This exchange, while seemingly neutral, opens up the c-file for potential future pressure and subtly challenges black's piece harmony. Reclaiming the pawn immediately re-establishes material balance and prepares to challenge white's central pawn structure, though it does expose the queen to a potentially active knight development. Unleashing a tactical whirlwind, white sacrifices the bishop to disrupt black's castled haven, aiming to exploit the exposed monarch and seize control of the open central files through aggressive piece play. Seeking to disrupt white's bishop pair advantage, this knight detour aims to harass the newly placed bishop and create counterplay by potentially targeting the queenside pawns. Capturing the knight opens a vital diagonal for your bishop, immediately threatening to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially isolate the a-pawn. This bold pawn grab forces black to react decisively, potentially leading to a pawn deficit if they try to recover the material. Consider how this piece exchange simplifies the position and creates immediate attacking avenues. Sacrificing a pawn for immediate attack seems tempting, but overlooking the queen's exposed position creates a dangerous counterplay. The initiative quickly shifts, and the exposed black king is now the primary target. Unleashing the queen here creates a fascinating tactical puzzle by immediately challenging the pawn on g2, forcing black to make a difficult decision about defending their king's shelter while also eyeing white's newly acquired central pawn. Striking back for the piece sacrificed. This capture on f3 aims to destabilize white's central pawn structure and open lines towards their king, potentially creating counterplay despite the material deficit. Reclaiming that central outpost after the knight sacrifice drastically improves white's queenside space and prepares for an active rook lift, potentially targeting black's king safety as the game simplifies. Black's pawn structure is now severely compromised, with doubled pawns on the a-file creating a permanent weakness. This move opens up a potentially dangerous diagonal for white's bishop and surrenders crucial pawn. Structure. Securing the open c-file and preparing to activate the rooks becomes paramount as white repositions their queen and knights, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed black king position. Solidifying the pawn structure. f6 aims to prevent white's knight from immediately occupying the e5 square and offers a defensive outpost for the knight if it retreats. However, it weakens the light squares around black's king and could become a long-term liability as white now has the open c-file and increased pressure on the queenside. Bringing the monarch into the fray. White seeks to activate its most important piece in this unbalanced material situation, aiming to exploit the lingering weaknesses on the queenside and initiate a more direct assault on black's kingside pawn structure, which has been somewhat compromised by the early capture on c7. Unleashing the bishop from its pawn shield. Black injects new activity into the center by pinning the knight. A bold attempt to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially exploit the slightly exposed king. Fortifying the rook's presence on the semi-open fourth rank now aims to pressure black's queenside pawns, potentially creating weaknesses on the b-file and the now exposed a6 square, while simultaneously defending the c3 knight. Black boldly reinforces the pressure on the c-file. A critical central artery now contested by white's rook and bishop. This maneuver not only solidifies control of the open file but also prepares for potential future threats against white's somewhat exposed king, aiming to exploit the pawn structure disarray on the queenside. Pushing the d-pawn opens a crucial diagonal for the queen but creates a weakness on the c4 square, a potential landing spot for black's pieces. Opening the diagonal for the queen's bishop and challenging white's central pawn thrust. This maneuver injects dynamism into black's position, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated piece play and prepare for counter-exploitation along the now freed c-file. Solidifying the central pawn and preparing to activate the queen's rook becomes paramount with this maneuver, aiming to establish a more robust pawn structure on the queenside and potentially contest the open c-file more effectively. Seizing the central square with the pawn creates a dynamic pawn chain and opens the e-file for potential piece activity, fundamentally altering the board's tension and forcing white to confront the encroaching infantry immediately. Initiating a pawn thrust on the e-file now opens lines for your pieces and pressures black's awkwardly placed knight, potentially forcing concessions or creating weaknesses around their king. Black mobilizes the pinned rook to an open file, aiming to break the central grip white has established and activate the previously restricted light squared bishop. Securing the kingside by advancing the rook to the open file immediately creates pressure, forcing black to confront the potential for a swift attack while simultaneously offering piece exchange to simplify the board. Seizing the open c-file offers black immediate counterplay and a chance to equalize the material disparity by targeting white's vulnerable pawn structure. Preparing to challenge the d-file with its rook, white aims to exploit the exposed black queenside pawns. Pouncing on the exposed queen file, black's rook now actively pressures white's center, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and potentially uncover attacking chances down the open g-file. If the rook on g3 proves vulnerable, a calculated risk to secure the queenside pawn majority, though it does concede a tempo, forcing the rook into a more passive defensive posture. Unpinning the rook and opening a diagonal for the bishop highlights a tactical necessity, though it cedes central control and invites a kingside pawn storm. The pawn push here seizes the open d-file, aiming to exploit the weakened queenside pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn challenging the very structure of white's queenside. This rook activation injects immediate tension, aiming to exploit the lingering weakness on the c-file and potentially disrupt the harmony of white's pawn chain, unearthing a new path for the monarch. The king embarks on a perilous journey towards the center, a calculated risk to bolster the pawn structure and perhaps join the fray. Though the lingering shadow of black's bishop pair and open files poses a significant threat to its safety, the rook's excursion to the queenside creates a tantalizing threat on the a-file, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure and forcing concessions, even as the pieces become more centralized. Activating the knight and preparing to contest the open file while simultaneously creating a potential outpost on c4. The black rook, having achieved its outpost, now eyes the 7th rank, disrupting white's pawn structure and creating immediate threats that demand attention. Stabilizing the pawn structure and preparing to activate the king becomes paramount here, as the immediate pressure on the a2 pawn is neutralized. Challenging the e-pawn and preparing to regroup the bishop into a more active role on the queenside underscores a keen positional understanding from black, aiming to activate previously dormant pieces and disrupt white's centralized pawn structure. Reasserting pressure along the open file becomes paramount, forcing black to confront the advanced passed pawn and preventing any sneaky maneuvers with the rook. The black rook, having completed its long journey from the action on the c-file, now re-establishes a presence on the first rank, aiming to disrupt white's newly consolidated position. This maneuver not only threatens to pry open the a-file but also indirectly pressures white's kingside pawn structure, potentially forcing concessions or creating weaknesses. The king's parade has ended. This capture clears the way for white's remaining pieces to assert themselves on the open board. The bishop's return to the open a-file signifies a shift in focus from material recovery to tactical exploitation of the compromised kingside pawn structure. A bold repositioning, aiming to solidify control over the now open central files and potentially create new attacking avenues for the rook. Embracing the pawn storm offers black a chance to create dynamic play, seeking active counterplay on the queenside while white's king remains somewhat exposed in the center. The advance directly challenges white's piece placement and seeks to disrupt any immediate consolidation. Unleashing a pawn storm begins, attempting to dismantle black's carefully constructed queenside pawn chain and open lines towards the entrenched king. Embracing the chaos of the queenside pawns, black initiates a daring pawn thrust, aiming to pry open the kingside defenses that white has so meticulously constructed, potentially creating a critical passed pawn or forcing a positional concession. Asserting control over the central open file, white finally clears the path for the rook to become an active participant, aiming to exploit the now exposed black king and the pawn weaknesses that have emerged from black's ambitious piece play. The bishop now retreats, seeking a safer square and perhaps a more active diagonal, a subtle shift from its earlier aggressive placement which forced white's hand. A risky gambit to seize material, sacrificing central control for a temporary pawn advantage that might prove ephemeral against black's advancing kingside pawns. Securing the monarch's safety becomes paramount as the board simplifies. The king steps forward to escape potential threats and prepare for active participation. Repositioning the knight to c4 aims to contest the open file and create a blockade, potentially preventing black's rook from becoming excessively active on the queenside while eyeing potential outposts. This strategic retreat aims to consolidate black's forces, seeking to redeploy the king to a more secure central position while potentially opening avenues for the rook on a4 to become more active again, perhaps eyeing the open c-file or supporting a pawn advance. Consolidating the bishop's influence on the queenside now sets a formidable trap, threatening to ensnare the black rook if it ventures too far from its defensive post on the fourth rank. Steering the bishop towards the queenside flank aims to untangle the piece from the defensive web, and prepare for a potential endgame by activating it on the queenside diagonal, potentially eyeing weaknesses that might arise after further pawn exchanges. Initiating knight activity towards the kingside aims to disrupt black's consolidated pawn structure and create potential mating threats, while simultaneously defending the advanced pawns and maintaining a flexible piece formation. The bishop now finds a slightly less active square, retreating from the immediate confrontation on the open c-file, suggesting black is prioritizing consolidation over further immediate exchanges. Bolstering the outpost on a5. This rook move seeks to cramp black's king and potentially disrupt any counterplay stemming from the queen's side. Bathing the dark-squared bishop in newfound freedom, black redirects his attention to reinforcing the king's sanctuary by consolidating the f6 square, reasserting pressure on the queenside and aiming to consolidate the pawn majority. This bishop retreat prepares to contest the open c-file while forcing black to define the fate of their advanced queenside pawns. Focusing on centralizing the bishop's power, black repositions the piece to e7, intending to support the passed pawn and prepare for potential action along the e-file or to defend against white's knight maneuvers. Securing the bishop's diagonal and preparing for potential kingside activity. This move aims to solidify white's hold on the center while simultaneously restricting black's active pieces. Recognizing the bishop's diminished role on the edge of the board, this repositioning aims to activate the piece, eyeing the critical kingside squares that white's pieces have been exploiting. Repositioning the bishop to the active diagonal creates potential threats against the black king, and aims to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure after black's earlier pawn sacrifices. Relocating the bishop to b6 creates a beautiful defensive outpost, guarding the pawn on a7 and preparing to hop to a5, which would then exert pressure along the 7th rank, re-establishing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal while offering a potential pawn push. Seems like the primary intention here, aiming to control central squares more effectively. Finally, the bishop attempts a daring repositioning, eyeing the exposed white king and aiming to reinforce the f-pawn's advance toward the queenside, securing that pawn from potential harassment by the opposing bishop creates a slight breathing room on the kingside, allowing for a more comfortable development of your remaining pieces without immediate threats. The bishop retreats to b6, a defensive maneuver seeking refuge from the looming knight on a5, while simultaneously preparing to potentially challenge the open lines that white has meticulously carved out, aiming to disrupt the coordination of black's remaining pieces. Unlocking the full potential of the queenside pawn chain becomes the immediate priority as this bishop repositions, preparing to join the fray and potentially harass black's rook. Unleashing the bishop to g2 forces white to confront the immediate threat of pawn advancement, potentially creating new weaknesses in their pawn structure and offering black improved attacking avenues against white's somewhat exposed king. Seeking to anchor the bishop and perhaps prepare a breakthrough on the kingside, though the king appears exposed. The bishop's relocation to d5 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create threats against the advanced pawn on h4, while simultaneously eyeing potential incursions into white's territory. A subtle pawn advance aiming to create a protected passed pawn, but it might be too slow to exploit white's slightly exposed king. Repositioning the bishop to c5 finally seeks to contest the influence white's bishop has on the long diagonal, aiming to create a more balanced pawn structure and deny white's pieces free rein. Preparing to activate the bishop by repositioning it to a square where it can survey more of the board. This thoughtful maneuver aims to break the current stalemate and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares on black's queenside, unleashing the bishop's potential. This maneuver seeks to activate the trapped piece and create an escape route, potentially setting up a dynamic exchange on the h1a8 diagonal if white is not careful. Reactivating the bishop's influence. The bishop retreats to a more commanding square, ready to control key diagonals and potentially disrupt the enemy king's safety or support an advance if the pawn structure allows. Shifting the bishop to b6 effectively reins in the g2 pawn's potential advance and offers the pawn on d5 a bit more breathing room, a crucial consideration as the material becomes more simplified. The bishop repositions, eyeing the h7 square while simultaneously defending the d2 pawn. A subtle but crucial repositioning aimed at disrupting black's kingside presence. Shifting the bishop to the queenside aims to create a blockade, preventing white's king from advancing further and supporting any potential pawn push, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the a2 pawn, pioneering a pawn's journey toward the 7th rank. This advance aims to disrupt the black king's sanctuary and create a formidable advanced outpost. The bishop's repositioning here aims to liberate the a-pawn, setting it up for a potential advance, while simultaneously reinforcing the defensive structure against any sudden tactical incursions by white's rook or bishop. Positioning the bishop to c3 aims to create a battery on the a5-d8 diagonal, pressuring black's increasingly passive bishop on d8 and potentially limiting its scope for the foreseeable future. The king abandons its safe haven for potentially aggressive play, venturing into a complex tactical web where its safety now hinges on precise piece coordination and anticipating pawn thrusts.